Robin Hood Radio presents Stage Right or Not with Michele Willens. Michele is a longtime journalist and herself is a published playwright of several theatrical works. She's a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post, Daily Beast, and the Atlantic websites.
Another opening of another show.
I returned to New York last week and hit the boards running. To Brooklyn, where an immersive and sadly relevant piece has been selling out nightly. To Broadway, where the same can be said of the gutsy transformation of a beloved novel. To a pair of off-Broadway shows, one about a famous conductor and the other about rugby of all things. And finally, a work from the writer behind the Oscar-winning movie Moonlight. So let's start with that one. Choir Boy, the latest Manhattan Theater Club production, has just opened at the Samuel Friedman Theater. This one takes place in a prep school for African-American boys and centers on a group that formed the school's choir. And within that, it focuses on one named Ferris, who is gay and takes a lot of verbal and even some physical abuse for that. "You've got to tighten up," he is warned by the headmaster. The voice of playwright Terrell Alvin McCraney is recognizable. He wrote the play from which Moonlight was adapted, and this one has many similarities. The piece is short on strong character development. Nonetheless, the very fine actors become specific individuals. Now, that includes Austin Pendleton, the one non-ethnic, playing a retired professor hired to bring some civility to the quarreling choir. And remember the name Jeremy Pope come Tony Award time. Now, there is some nudity in Choir Boy and some body part humor, both within nicely crafted scenes while the boys prepare to shower. "It's locker room talk," says one, generating some laughter from the audience. The obvious reference to the current president may or may not be necessary, but, well, who can resist these days? "Sounds like Kanye at a press conference," is another line, clearly reaching for an easy laugh. While Choir Boy does not qualify as a musical, I don't think, there are more than a few lovely sung performances, from the spiritual variety to Motown, and some fantastic choreography. Now, to transition to Kill a Mockingbird. Well, race is clearly an element of both, and both, I might add, have red brick walls for their sets for whatever reason. Aaron Sorkin's adaptation of Harper Lee's iconic novel is a controversial, though mostly applauded adaptation that has been open for a month at the Schubert. I love the book. I saw the movie multiple times. I dressed as Scout for my 6th grade Come As You Wish You Were Day, so I guess I would be considered a tough-to-please customer. Well, fortunately, the key components are all here. I easily recognize the "Hey, Mr. Cunningham" scene from outside the jail, and "Hey, Boo, Radley is back," as are all the characters. Some have been tampered with slightly, most notably Atticus, who, despite defending a black man in the Deep South, has a stubborn belief that there is inherent goodness, even in the most unneighborly of folks. Well, for some, maybe even for Sorkin, this conjures up our presidents. Here again, there are good people on both sides theory. Jeff Daniels is excellent in the role. Not Gregory Peck, but possibly a man with more on his mind. In the play, Atticus's son, Jem, and his housekeeper, Calpurnia, are the ones to question his beliefs, particularly the latter, who had virtually no role in the originals besides serving supper. But here she serves as our contemporary voice of warning. Sometimes it struck me as a little too contemporary. Did we really talk about passive aggressiveness way back then? Scout and Jem's summertime friend, Dill, is played by Gideon Glick, a fine actor associated with openly gay roles. Yes, now many of us learned that Dill was based on Truman Capote, and as good, sensitive, and funny as Glick can be, the interpretation felt at times like a jarring stretch. One of the controversial choices made in this production, directed by Bartlett Sher, is having adults play the children's roles. Well, it's not a new technique, and let's not forget that Harper Lee's story is essentially a memory piece. Celia Keenan-Bolger as Scout is spot on. My qualms are the show's length. It feels plodding and repetitive at times. The ending can't seem to decide upon its final resolution. Also, much of the narration is unnecessary. Now, that's a pet peeve of mine. It's usually associated with shows that are based on beautifully written works, so sort of the wrong tactic for the right reasons. But here there are really too many times when we are told what is about to happen while we are watching it. Jem got his pants torn. I got my pants torn. Now, I am a true Lou Aaron Sorkin fan, and, well, it's no surprise from the man who gave us The West Wing, The American President, and Newsroom, that his version here is filled with good, if often preachy lines. A person is right, but people are wrong. Where is that written? Asked one character in the trial that here frames the play. In the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, comes the reply. Well, there are those who say Harper Lee must be crying in her grave. My feeling is she'd be satisfied. It's a Mockingbird rejiggered for our times. Will it outlast the book and the film? Probably not. Now, as for the pair of smaller shows I saw, Alone It Stands, written and directed by John Breen, is part of the Irish Festival at 59 East 59th theaters. 6 very good actors managed to make the most of its tiny space. They use no props as they play members of a sports team called the All Blacks, not referring to their color, by the way, but their uniforms. It's not about the best players, it's horse trading, says one character, implying not so subtly to the politics behind sports. It's also about the often abusive forms of coaching these days. He is training us like he hates us, notes one player. There is some nice humor here. Watch the one female character through her childbirth, and a lot of tackling talk, so it's likely not the show for everyone. But at 90 minutes long, with an unnecessary intermission, or halftime as they call it, it's a lot less painful than the treatment most of the athletes around the world get. A different kind of verbally abusive treatment is handed out by famed Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini in a show called Maestro, now playing at the Duke on 42nd Street. If you want to go to sleep, go home, he yells at his orchestra. Now, this show comes from the Ensemble for the Romantic Century Company. Its mission, created in 2001 by pianist Eve Wolf, is to present what it calls theatrical concerts. Maestro is written by Wolf, and that means Toscanini, well portrayed by John Noble, talks a bit about his life, often using letters or other written materials, and then he exits while musicians come on stage to play pieces associated with the impresario. The first act takes place in Europe while Hitler and Mussolini are rising, and whom Toscanini was bravely contesting. He left for Palestine to support the Jewish cause and ultimately emigrated to New York. The show begins, and the second act continues with his experience at Rockefeller Center, where he led the first NBC orchestra for a popular radio broadcast. If you are a classical musical lover, you'll hear enough Verdi, Liszt, and even Gershwin to satisfy. Verdi told me that every beat has its own life, says Toscanini. Well, this all takes place back then. Of course, it also resonates. We are in the hands of a man who is mad, says Toscanini, also referring at times to the false news. These are hard shows to pull off. Maestro is well-intentioned, for sure, but could have used better conducting to make it truly come to life. One issue Toscanini does mention is refugees, and that is a fitting opening for my final show, about which I don't want to say too much, because The Jungle at St. Anne's Warehouse in Brooklyn until the end of this month is a complete sellout, though there is always a chance of grabbing a seat if you show up and others do not. The Jungle, in brief, is a true story of a camp that sprang up in Calais and saw its brutal ending just 2 years later. The show is truly immersive. The theater has been transformed into the refugee camp. I doubt it will be extended since it next goes to San Francisco, but I am sure The Jungle will come back to us in some way at some time. As long as there are refugees, Jill, there will hopefully be stories about them.
The Jungle is a really interesting a quick news leap, and that is one of the things that I am constantly getting into arguments with people about. Is that there's no follow-up. That's now the good news is that's the province for plays and theater and movies and whatnot. But as it's happening, it was a huge deal. It was really unpleasant.
You mean the actual refugee camp?
The actual, yeah. There was a reason it was called the jungle, etc. And it was finally, after a long time, dismantled. And it's just, again, there's no thread as you go through it. It's almost reporting afterwards. So I just think that it's incredibly important because, any displacement, it's just assumed that pick a hurricane, pick an act of
yes.
You have to leave your home, grab your dogs and go to a shelter.
Yeah, exactly. And doesn't this, though, celebrate, in a way, the beauty of art and what art can do? The Jungle was written by two guys who had never written a show before, if I'm not wrong. And they were at the Jungle to do art projects with the refugees. And their experience there led them to say, why don't we write a play about what happened these last 2 years? So that was amazing. And then they got it on a small stage in London, and then it went to a larger stage in London. And then the artistic director of St. Anne's saw it there and brought it here. And by the way, it was not uncomplicated to bring here because all the actors needed visas. And that's a story in itself. 3 of the actors didn't get their visas till like a few days before the show was set to open. They had understudies here ready to take the roles. So there's, plays behind the plays behind the plays, or stories behind the stories behind the stories. But it's the beauty of art that hopefully this will keep the issue, which never goes away, somewhat alive.
Stage Right or Not with Michele Willens, produced in the studios of Robin Hood Radio, robinhoodradio.com.